Your child understands the concepts, but takes time when it comes to writing. That one observation, very quietly, starts worrying a lot of parents. Not because the child doesn't know, but because they are not able to show what they know within those 3 hours of an exam. Hello, this is Maneesha Rajpal, and you are listening to Inner Architecture. This is a space where we explore how the mind, the nervous system, and our deeper behavioral patterns shape the way we learn, perform, and how confident we feel while doing it. And today, I am going to talk about something that often doesn't get discussed openly, but quietly sits at the back of many parents' minds. You know that moment. Your child comes back after an exam, you look at the paper and you can clearly see they know the answers. The concepts are there, the understanding is there, but still something feels incomplete because they took too long to write. And sometimes it shows up in very small ways. One last answer left unfinished. A sentence that just stops midway, even though they knew exactly what to write. And somewhere along the way, you have probably heard this. Your child needs to work on speed. They are not finishing on time. And very naturally, a deeper question begins to form. Is this just a habit? Or is there something more going on here? Is this something to be concerned about or something we simply don't yet understand? These questions don't come from panic. They come from care and from wanting to do the right thing for your child. And that's exactly, they deserve clarity, not quick labels, not assumptions, and definitely not unnecessary fear. Because in everyday conversations, we often group things together as if they are the same. Slow writing, poor handwriting, learning difficulties. Almost as if they all belong to one category. But they don't. And this is where a small misunderstanding can quietly become a much bigger concern. Because slow writing in itself is a behavioral pattern. It is something we observe. Whereas a learning disability is a neurological condition. It affects how information is processed, stored, and expressed. And when these get confused, children begin to carry labels they may not even need. Parents begin to feel anxious earlier than required. And sometimes it shows up in very real moments. The child knows there is more to write. They are still thinking, but the bell rings. And they have to stop. And the paper goes incomplete. Not because of lack of understanding, but because time ran out. If you look at educational research across the world, roughly 5 to 8% of children are identified with diagnosable learning disability. But classroom observation consistently show that a much larger group, around 15 to 20%, struggle with writing speed at some point. Which means, in a typical classroom, there are several children struggling with writing speed without any underlying disorder. Now, just pause here for a moment, because that one observation quietly changes how we need to look at the problem. And if this is resonating with you, you may want to save this episode so that you can come back to these insights whenever you need clarity. Because there are far more children who write slowly than children who actually have a learning disability. And when we miss the difference, we don't just misunderstand the problem. We risk responding in a way that may not truly support the child. And this is where the misunderstanding actually starts. Slowness by itself is far more common than pathology because writing is not just a thinking task, it is also a neuromuscular process. Every word your child writes requires coordination. Coordination between the brain, the nervous system, the fine muscles of the hand. And even when understanding is completely intact, if this coordination is under strain, writing naturally begins to slow down. Not because the child doesn't know, but because the translation from thought to movement is under tension. And this is where many children get misunderstood. Think of a mechanical wristwatch. When everything is balanced, it runs smoothly. But when the spring is overwound, something subtle begins to shift. It still works at first, but internally tension builds. Over time, movement becomes uneven. Accuracy drops and eventually it slows down. Not because it was defective, but because it was under constant excess tension. And very often, slow writing follows the same pattern. The child is thinking, understanding is there, answers are known, but writing is happening under strain. And that's why the output slows down. And if you look closely, what sits underneath is not inability, but fatigue, unseen effort, and a child who's quietly working harder than they should. You may notice it. Writing starts well, but gradually loses consistency. Speed drops, grip tightens, energy dips. Not because understanding has stopped, but because the effort has become too heavy to sustain. And this is the part that often gets overlooked. Because when slow writing is not a learning disability, it follows a pattern. The child can explain clearly when speaking. Answers are correct verbally. Writing starts well, then declines. Fatigue appears in longer tasks. But in learning disability, the difficulty is consistent and widespread. It shows up across multiple areas, not just writing. And this brings us to something very important. The key difference is pattern, not pace. Because pace can change, but patterns reveal what's really happening underneath. And when slow writing is labeled too quickly, children begin to lose confidence. Effort gets misread as inability, and very quietly, fear begins to replace curiosity. And sometimes this is where it begins. A child starts to believe, maybe I am not capable. Maybe I am falling behind. Maybe I am not good enough. But in reality, there may be strain where there should be ease. So what can you do? Shift your attention just slightly from what your child writes to what it costs them to write it. Because the slowing pace, the rising effort, that moment when fatigue quietly sets in, that's where the real story is. Not in the final answer, but in the experience behind it. Separate understanding from speed. Ask yourself, can my child explain this clearly when speaking? If yes, then writing speed is not a reflection of learning ability. And gently shift the language. Instead of, why are you so slow? Try asking, that looked tiring. What part felt difficult? Because when a child feels seen, they begin to open up. And remember, progress doesn't come from pressure. It comes from understanding. Speed by itself is never the full picture. Slow writing is not a verdict. It's a signal. A signal that asks to be understood before it is interpreted. And if something in this stayed with you, not as an answer, but as a question, stay with it. because sometimes that pause is where deeper understanding begins. And sometimes the question is not just why writing becomes slow, but whether something much earlier, much more basic, has been shaping that speed all along. In the next episode, we'll explore why children should not be writing in print or following a copybook style of writing, and how these early habits can quietly influence writing speed over time. This is Maneesha Rajpal, and you have been listening to Inner Architecture. Until next time, observe patiently, interpret thoughtfully, and allow development to unfold.